Welcome back to Lambda Bible Studies and a new guest I'm very excited to have on today, Robert McDonald. How are you doing?
Good. Glad to be here.
I'm very excited to have you, and I'll tell you how I came across you. This is the platform formerly known as Twitter, and you did a series of polls to try to find who's the ideal bachelor under 35 in the dissident right and adjacent circles. And in the second poll, as you can see, is it fair to say I stomped the competition? I
Yes.
absolutely destroyed. Paul Clossington came in second.
Yeah,
And
he
then
was my top pick actually when I in the stream.
I
But
love Clossington. I wonder if I've had Clossington on the channel. I think if you go back far enough, I once had him on here. But yes, I'm a fan of Clossington, so I'm a little sad, but in the spirit of competition, as a
he is
man.
taken, so I found out later. So
Oh, so he shouldn't have even been in the running, really.
no, I didn't realize until after I set all my notes up that he's engaged. And actually, I
Well,
think he's getting
congratulations,
married in
Clossington.
spring. Yeah. So, but I mean, if you think about it, then it's like, well, I was right to pick him first. Then he did it.
Yeah, yeah. He's kind of proven his worth in the
Yes.
real world. He's got the what do they say in economics? Not just votes, not just opinions, but he's got the actual acted out preferences.
Yeah.
So me, Prude, and Charlie won our respective polls. Um, so yeah, what led you to running these?
Well, I'm part of I have my own channel, which is Robert McDonald on YouTube, and then I do a podcast with three other guys called The Fading Giant, and that comes out every Monday. And we decided to look at the a bachelor's under 35 in the distant right and surrounding spheres to kind of highlight different masculine traits, abilities, tendencies that you should focus on, and then ones
Mm-hmm.
you should try to overcome and deal with, and trying to use these guys that are known to people as real examples rather than talking theoretical, and so that we can actually point to, this guy has had this level of success. Maybe if he did this, he would be more successful. Or, like we mentioned, Geo, I put him up as what I view as most improved because he's done a lot of hard work to improve himself, and he's having success relationally because of that.
I was going to say, is he taken at this point as well?
He's in
Chris,
a relationship. I'm not.
there you go.
I don't know many details other than that she's American, so it's long distance. But hey, he's doing it. That's good.
And you also have a YouTube channel, which
Yes.
people can find here. I think these ats you can now do if you do youtube.com and then slash and the at or something. But I guess if people type in Robert McDonald channel, or I've
Yeah.
linked it in the description. So loads of really good stuff here. Um, so
Yeah. In my
talking about
channel,
sexuality and gender and
yeah,
kind of
I focus on men's issues a lot,
yeah.
but then everything that has to do with it. So not just men's issues like we think of, but also marriage, family, gender relations, anything that men have a responsibility for, duty. So it extends out into community and nation. But if I address anything political, I always try to bring it back to that point. So it's not just rank punditry for the most part. And then I also focus a lot on dealing with porn and related
Hmm.
sex issues, addiction, and some addiction and mental health issues in general. And I really try to focus on practical aspects because there's a lot of people who do good work that's explicitly Christian and very solidly rooted in the Bible. And then you have the very secular, like NoFap. And so I'm trying to kind of do a middle part where it's really talking about, okay, we got these good ideas. How do we to implement them in your daily life? How do you form new habits to get rid of your bad habits? Things like that.
So you've got 143 subscribers as of the time of going live. I want everyone listening to go and subscribe to the channel and watch a couple of videos, and see if we can make a significant impact on this excellent YouTube channel. I think you're doing everything right, but as we know, the algorithm is not kind to our spaces. So
Thank you.
It would be great to. I think it's great to highlight people, people who are making valuable content, and I think it'd be good for people to go and check that out. So great. Right, let's get turned to the topic for this stream, which I believe is identity. What made you interested in that topic for today?
Well, this is a little bit of an extension off the episode with the of the Fading Giants that I did those polls from, because I was kind of thinking through the steps of what men need to do. And as men, we are driven by whatever we feel is our purpose, our mission, our calling, etc. But before you can really understand what that is, you need to be sure of yourself. You need to be confident. You need to, if you have trauma or addiction, you need to heal and overcome, or grow up, maybe too, whatever your situation may be. And oftentimes for people, it can be a mixed bag. You could be a very good hard worker who's solid at work, but you could come home and be very emotionally immature. Mm-hmm. So you could be a mix of things, but until you get your whole self healed, grown, and going forward, it's going to be hard for you to understand what your purpose and mission is, what you're standing on, what you're rooted in, and where you're supposed to go forward. Say if you feel like you're called to serve God, well, not everybody can be a pastor. Mm-hmm. Maybe you're actually better off being a mechanic because you love cars and you love working with your hands, and you do pro bono work on the side. You're still serving God, but you're doing it in a very different way that you wouldn't understand until you're sure of yourself and what you are supposed to be. And so kind of coming back to that very base level of our being is where I'm coming from with this today.
And I've noticed that identity is quite a hot button issue. People talk about identity politics a lot, and of course people use the fact that they consider their identity to be their sexuality as an argument to mean that it should be defended. You can't tell somebody to stop expressing themselves in certain ways without destroying who they are at a deep level. So it'd be good to during this stream think about that a bit, dig into some scripture, understand as Christians where do we find our identity, and explore that deeply. I suspect people are going to say, oh, your identity should be as a Christian, and draw a line there. And I think there's more to this question than that. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, because if you think about it, I mean, yeah, we're children of God, but so is about 1 billion people. So while that's important, that doesn't tell us a lot. At least maybe not as it used to in the past. I think in the past it wasn't so hard to understand, but today we really have to relearn a lot of this again.
Especially when there's a lot of lies told as well. So not only are we not understanding things that we should about ourselves, we're also believing things that are not true in addition. There's the you must unlearn what you have learned aspect here as well. Where should we start then?
Well, I kind of said it in the sense that men are purpose-driven. We're doers, builders, protectors, providers, leaders. Even the words husband and father contain action. As Benjamin Boyce recently said, the attention of a man on something or someone magnifies it. And I think that was a really interesting thought, that our focus, our energy, our actions do that, in contrast to women who are very much a reflection, and they add to and uplift, but it's a very different way. And this is why you always see with the genders, you see the sun is male and the moon is female, because that reflects that imagery. And then we see in the Bible, we see people like Moses was called as a messenger and deliverer, David as a king, Jeremiah as a prophet, and Paul as an apostle. Yet before their callings, they're all acting. And even before that, they had an identity. Um, and we see this with Paul in Philippians chapter 3, verse 5, where he said he was circumcised the eighth day of the nation of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews. The first half of Paul's identity predates his birth or was set by others. And that's a significant point in contrast, because if you think about your identity and what forms it, your biological race, your ethnic makeup, nation of birth, ancestral line, family, and therefore surname, hometown, your gender, your name, were all set prior to your birth or shortly after conception. And the roots of many of these facets of your identity go back generations. Furthermore, your basic morality, beliefs, conception of masculinity, femininity, relationships, etc., were all ingrained in you as a child before you had a conscious choice to choose. And so, if you think about how much of your identity is actually built even before you even know yourself as an individual, like babies up until I think it's about 1.5, don't hardly have a conception of their individual being outside of their mother to start with. And so that kind of illustrates how much of our identity is set before we even have an opportunity to influence or build that.
So in the chapter here, Paul is saying that these things that you mentioned, being a circumcised Israeli Benjaminite, a Pharisee, a zealous, religious, faultless person, these are all aspects of himself that would have been considered in his upbringing great values, really positive things that should have boosted his ego. And then he flips it then and says, actually, though these were gains to me, I now think of them as loss for the sake of Christ, because everything's a loss compared to the surpassing worth of knowing. I think this is a sort of hyperbolic statement, right? He's saying Jesus is so significant and important to me that this lot is almost irrelevant. So should we therefore abandon caring about anything other than Christ? Is identity should it purely be a matter, like you were saying, well, there's a billion people who are Christians or whatever, but perhaps they should all unite as an undifferentiated mass of Christians. What do you think?
That's a great question, an important one. It's actually about a hierarchy of aspects of your identity, because I don't see God denying our ancestry, because I forget where in Acts it talks about he formed the nations and set their boundaries. So nationhood is something from God. He made the different families, as it talks about that we blessed through Abraham. So it's actually about, it's not canceling your previous identities. It's a hierarchy of identities. Just because a man is a Christian doesn't mean he ceases to be a father or a brother or a son or a husband. He still has those, and the Bible is very explicit about you have a responsibility to do that, like in 1 Timothy 5:8, where it says if you neglect those duties, you're as bad as a non-believer. You're actually worse. So it's a matter of a hierarchy of identity. Like one guy I used to listen to talked about how the gospel is our software and our hardware is how God made us. And that's why it's okay to have some differences in church and faith between peoples, but yet we can have that overarching umbrella of Christianity.
And I always remember in Revelations that talks about. Let me find it actually. I think it's Revelation 7. Let's see. There it is. There's a great multitude from every nation, tribe, people, and language standing before the throne, wearing white robes and holding palm branches, and they cried aloud in one voice, "Salvation belongs to our God, who sits on the throne, to the Lamb." And this is a kind of expression of the nations and tribes, peoples and languages continuing to exist, I think, and be important.
They're still relevant.
And yet they are also in unity.
Yeah.
So like you're saying, it's the prioritization of Christ above everything else, but not excluding everything else.
Yeah, and we see that hierarchy in hyperbolic language where when Jesus turns to his disciples and says, "Whoever follows me should hate their mother and father." Well, obviously he's not speaking literally, because that would be a violation of one of the commandments.
Right.
We're not supposed, and in fact, he criticizes the Pharisees for violating that commandment. Rather, he is emphasizing a hierarchy of priorities. So we should serve God first, and then honor our parents.
If we were talking to people who were nationalist first and Christian second, and they were compromising their worship of God for their love of their people, then the rebuke would be from Philippians. Paul considered all of that stuff loss in comparison to the surpassing greatness of Christ. But it's probably more the case these days that people are completely unmoored from knowing how to think about who they are outside of Christ. So we're saying, let's not lose that centrality of Jesus, but let's relearn some of the other aspects of our existence.
Yes.
Fair?
Yep, I agree.
All right, where next?
So when we think about this, about how much our identity has very deep roots, then we have to conclude that the blank slate doctrine is false. And the greater implication of that is that humanist philosophy, which is the foundation of all the different leftist philosophies, whether, communism, socialism, all the variations like Fabian, all the way over to libertarianism, essentially all we call liberalism, are sitting on a false idea, a false doctrine. Because man cannot form man into something new or different than God intended. Man, by man's abilities, cannot create a new human race or ascend to a higher state of being by man's own effort, as we see attempted at the Tower of Babel, or today with transhumanism or transgenderism.
Yeah, and the humanist concept is, in a way, a weird modern idea. We see it permeating so far and in so many forms that it feels like it must be a fairly normal human attitude, but actually we're kind of, Christianity is having to respond to something that is particular to our time and to some degree place.
I think you hit on it actually correctly. I think humanism is a philosophy based on a human nature flaw that I think, if you want to, we talked about more recent stuff, but I cited the Tower of Babel. I also would consider elevating the king. Did you start? Where are we replaying from?
Are you okay? I've lost you.
I also think about raising kings to divinity.
Are you still there?
Yeah, I'm still here.
I slightly missed what you were saying there. You were
are you hearing
kings?
me play back? Yeah.
Are you hearing your own voice back?
Yes.
That might. Have you got a tab open? Maybe. No.
I'm looking.
It's absolutely impossible. By the way, for anybody who's never live streamed, if you end up hearing yourself in your ears, it's so distracting.
Okay, I think I got it.
Yeah.
Okay,
Okay.
so
Good.
I I was talking about how I think this is rooted in a human nature flaw, and like
Hmm.
I cited the Tower of Babel, and I also look at how different cultures would view their king or emperor pharaoh as God or godlike, or would rise to godhood, or was son of God. And then I let's think back to Eve reaching for the apple. Remember, it describes that as reaching for divine knowledge. So I think there is a certain part of us, on one hand, it's a desire to know God, but it's kind of twisted to trying to doing it on our own terms through our own abilities. Instead of knowing God, we want to be as God.
Hmm.
And I think that's the root of humanism ultimately. And then of course if it's that deep, then obviously there's a conflict in our identity.
Hmm. And the whole premise of a lot of this kind of humanist, liberal, it's the utopian dream. You mentioned the Tower of Babel, or it's the kings conspiring together in Psalm 2. It's the surely we can come up with a unified vision for humanity that doesn't require God. We all band together and can create something higher and greater than that which God has given us, in opposition to here is a particular view that we've received directly from God, and uh, we learn who we are not by just looking within, but by looking up to the Creator who after all made us and knows us better than we can know ourselves.
Yeah, yeah, very much so.
Okay, have you got which way should we go? Either your kind of
Well,
personal anecdotes or scripture. I feel like
the personal part was actually next.
great.
Uh, my name that I have up, Robert McDonald, is actually I chose that for a really particular purpose. That was a important part of my growth and understanding myself. I created the name from Robert Burns and George MacDonald, two Scottish uh, writers, and reading their biographies really helped me understand myself a lot. Because growing up, I would have what you could describe as big emotions, and I didn't know how to cope with them. And I really didn't understand why I would feel so strongly, why I would be moved so deeply by different situations or experiences or stimuli. And that partly led me into addiction, trying to cope. And what I started reading these biographies. I mean, there's a lot more to my story, but for this particular point, I started reading some biographies, and I've always loved my Scottish heritage. So I read one about Robert Burns, and I could see a lot of myself in him about the
Hmm.
creativeness, writing, being moved deeply, and but he never learned to cope with it, and so he actually died at 36 because he basically burnt out, and he had affairs and fathered children by many women, and so while he is a creative genius, he ultimately died in a sad way.
Hmm.
In contrast, George MacDonald, which was an influence for many great writers like Tolkien and Lewis, and is very much cited as the father of the modern genre of fantasy,
Hmm.
but also wrote many sermons as well. He also had these great feelings and was deeply moved and struggled with ill health, and yet he had a good life, lived in happiness and peace with one wife, raising 11 kids, and lived to 81. And I thought this was a amazing contrast. Like I don't want to burn out at 36. That sounds miserable. And then I also read about Leonardo da Vinci, and it's kind of the third option, if you will. whereas he embraced the sensuality and impulsiveness and chased it, to his detriment. So I saw these as very three distinct paths that
Mm.
someone with an artistic personality like myself could take. Whereas, and I see someone like that who I would say like is a man of heart, where you feel deep, strong emotions, even when it's not necessarily something you would particularly think, like someone you love passing away. But it could be a story, it could be a movie, it could be a scene in nature, and you just move deeply. And I think that's just the way people are if they're of that artistic nature, and it helps them create that art because then they can form it into some kind of art that is great. It makes life better. But if you don't understand that's how you work, that you're going to react in a big way, it can be overwhelming. And we see this in that a lot of artists struggle with addiction, sexual deviancy, and other problems, and often burn out young and sadly. And so that really, so I took those names as kind of a symbolism of my two options or my two sides, if you will. And it really helped me understand myself because I grew up in the Midwest in a very Germanic family that didn't talk about emotions a lot, and so I really just didn't understand how to deal with them, and that helped a lot. And I think looking at biographies can help you a lot because these are men that it's history, it's already in the past, so we can look at how they handled these different traits, characteristics, flaws, strengths, and situations, and you can see how they handled them and whether they were successful or not. And you can learn a lot by reading biographies of people in the past.
Mm.
And it also makes me think about the different types of men because like I talked about, I consider the artist type person to be kind of a man of heart, in other words, driven by sensation and emotion, and who have to guard against a tendency towards impulsiveness, pursuing the new or the sensational.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas some men are more live by their mind. You think of an academic or a scientist, and they have to guard against being arrogant and thinking everything can be talked out. Or you have the man of action, or he lives by his hands. He's building, creating, growing, and he has to be guarded against being reactive or violent. And then lastly, the man of soul, like a pastor or a mentor, who has to guard against being so heavenly minded they are no earthly good. I do think we need to encourage and build up all four aspects because we have aspects of all these because we're physical beings with a mind and with a heart and a soul. But we do tend towards one as our primary. And that I think understanding that about you will help you choose a fitting career, lifestyle, and hobby, and help you understand how best you may serve God, your family, community, and live a fulfilling life.
We've for some reason been encouraged to detach ourselves from history, to
Mm-hmm.
live with a memory span of about 24 hours at most, which leaves us each to um, learn all of our mistakes from scratch, and perhaps worse, that we naturally will gravitate towards and copy the people that we are watching and thinking about. So I very much echo the value of finding good role models, people who, I mean, do both, I suppose, both learning from the terrible tragedy that other people have lived before to avoid it, but then also finding examples of people's lives who you would like to replicate, and something realistic, something that you can learn from. It's like the whatever is good and pleasing and praiseworthy. Think on these things. The a walk in the way of a good man. We can form our identity to some degree over time, we make choices in the moment that defines who we are, but maybe it's under-examined the effect of the choices that we make that are small, ongoing, regular choices over a period of years and decades. And it's amazing how much your life can be transformed through just the power of time and a little bit of attention. Just a small steer, like a rudder.
Mm-hmm.
That's, a ship moves gradually. It's not like an F1 car where it's got this positive feedback on the steering. You change something and you don't necessarily see the effect, but it is a powerful. We can direct ships very precisely. It's just that the steering it's a small force acting over a long period of time, and I think our lives are often like that. That little decisions that we make that don't seem to make any difference accumulate over the course of weeks and months and years, and become way more powerful in our lives than we could ever have imagined. All right, should we dig into some scripture?
Yeah. And just a quick point on just at the beginning, what you were saying there, that disconnect from the past, I think it's on purpose, because if we're cut off from our foundation and our roots, just like saying if you're cut off from the rock of God, it's the same thing from a spiritual standpoint as it is physically and mentally and emotionally. We're cut off from our roots, we're adrift. And that means we're much more open to manipulation and control by others who have an agenda different than God's.
It's amazing how quickly you can spot lies that you're being told, even very practical lies in the present, by just knowing a little bit more about history.
Yes, and that's a great example of how that goes. And all that comes down to one of my favorite verses. I want to say this is what you will find in step 4 of 12 steps that's explicitly Christian, if I remember right. And it's about self-examination, which I find is a very helpful thing to do, like say once a week. Just sit down and think about how you handled your up and downs during the week. How did you react? Was that the best way? How are you focusing? Are you living your stated priorities, etc.? So I always think of that with Lamentations 3:40. Let us examine our ways and test them, and let us return to the Lord.
Yeah, that's a constant practice where we will always find that. I think when we test our ways, we inevitably will conclude that some amount of return is necessary. We are endlessly wayward, and if we feel like we're perfectly walking in the right way, we probably need to look closer.
Yeah.
Great. Okay.
And then just kind of tying that with our previous point, we have a duty and responsibility to think on this and figure it out, as Peter says in 1 Peter 4:10. As each one has received a special gift, employ it in serving one another as good stewards of the manifold grace of God. And I don't think it's an accident that Jesus' parable of talents in Matthew 25, that they use that word talent. I don't think it's an accident that form of currency corresponds to our English word of ability, because that's what he's really talking about in that parable, is ability and gifts, which we sometimes overemphasize about spiritual gifts. But if you think about even some of the gifts as they're listed, like healing, for example, that's not necessarily miraculous. You could be a nurse or a doctor too, or dietitian, or someone who encourages people to work out. That's all healing and health related, and it could be about your talents. Like um, men who are very physically oriented um, often love to work out, and it's often an avenue to fellowship with other men and to mentor younger men. And I see this emphasized, like one of my friends, Noah. He's an electrician, so he's doing something physically. He really enjoys working out, and it's through this that he is able to fellowship and reach out and mentor to other men.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a good way to see that correlation of his abilities and gifts that he has from God, that he's turned towards making a living to provide for his wife and kids, while at the same time building up his self and his health and helping other men do the same.
The concept that the things we have been given come with responsibilities is a big challenge in this passage. I think
Mm-hmm.
for people who find themselves thinking, "Oh, I've lucked out in life. I've got all of this. I've got all of this raw talent. I've got these resources. I've got these positions." I always think it's worth remembering. It's Luke 12, I believe, where it says, yeah, the one, yes, from everyone who has been given much, much will be demanded, and from the one who has been entrusted with much, much more will be asked. So part of the reason for this self-discovery of understanding what gifts you individually have received, the reason for needing to know your identity is because not only do you, in the abstract, learn who you are, but actually who you are and what you have access to determines what God wants you to do.
Mm-hmm.
It actually tells you your responsibilities. So,
Yeah, like
as a prerequisite of living correctly, you have to examine yourself.
my example on Noah, he could just take care of his family and do a good job as an electrician, and that's not bad. That's meeting his basic purpose as a man. But he has done a lot of work to deal with his struggles and things in his past, and so he's learned about himself, and so he's building himself up through working out, and then he's also helping other men deal with their past struggles and helping them be healthier. So because he is taking that time to learn about who he is and to grow and heal, he's able to ascend higher levels of purpose and meaning.
Awesome. Where next? But for the I feel like this is the kind of stream where we're on a bit of a safari. We're going from spot to spot. We're looking out and seeing what we can see, and then move on to the next. Sometimes I do streams where it's one passage and we're deep
Mm-hmm.
diving. We're just pitching a tent and staying in one location for the night. But today we're looking to roam and understand the landscape.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I tend to be that way. Um, I think we can see this process in this process of my own journey. I thought often on the books of First and Second Timothy and Titus. If
Mm-hmm.
we look at Timothy, he was a Greek, a Jew, a Christian, a leader in the church, and a disciple of Paul. I mean, these are all aspects of his identity that are deeply rooted in his family, and we see at least 3 generations of Christians that he stands at the head of, according to 2 Timothy 1. And he had gifts, according to 1 Timothy 4:14, that he readily employed, as Peter and Jesus previously said, as we saw.
That
And
sounds
so I
right.
think, like of everything we're saying here, we can look at Timothy as a young man. I think I was reading that they believe he may have started being associated with Paul even possibly as young as a teenager, certainly as a very young man. And so he had that that journey as a very young man to grow and try to develop and understand his purpose and his position.
And it's possible to neglect a gift, which is interesting.
Mm-hmm.
That you can be given something and it can essentially lie fallow, as if you inherited a field and let it become overgrown
Mm-hmm.
instead of planting it and weeding it and using it for great good. And yeah, again, you have to be able to identify individually. And so, perhaps for some people listening to this, they might think, I actually don't have much going for me. I don't have much to offer. I suspect that's not as true, unless somebody, and I doubt any of the Lambda Bible Studies listeners are sort of plugged into they're in hospital completely immobile and
Mm-hmm.
they have random YouTube channels on some sort of algorithm that they've ended up here. If that is you, I mean, you've lucked out. This is going to be the most beneficial random YouTube content that you could possibly have lucked into. Everybody else listening to this has at least the capacity to, access the internet. They can probably move. They can probably talk. They can there's a bare minimum of gifts that you've been given. And I suspect if you think harder, you've got loads of specific things that God has given you in terms of resources, in terms of connections, in terms of abilities. And if you're diligent and creative, you can turn those things to work. The equivalent of taking the field and that is arable but unplowed and making it fruitful.
And I think that's what you're citing with a person who doesn't feel like they have anything special about them. I think that's someone who hasn't taken the time to understand themselves yet. And
Yes.
so they're not recognizing their gifts because either they're undeveloped or neglected, or
Mm-hmm.
they've been, some people are beat down. And so it's hard to see that.
Mm-hmm.
They may even be practicing their gift and using it. They just may have so little confidence and a sense of self-worth that they don't even realize they're doing it,
Mm-hmm.
because it's very much a part of our individual nature. Whatever our gifts and talents and ability are, it's part of our individual nature.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to do it unless something stops us.
And so, something I think that's exciting about this is that we are going to be able to follow these commands to make the most of our gifts, regardless of what the future holds. There's no material situation so bad that all of our possessions may be taken from us. We may lose a degree of our fitness, of our status, but all we're called to is to examine the situation we're in and make the most of where we're at, and that fundamental attitude that should grow in us as we are sanctified over time. The continuing, ongoing understanding of our own identities is critical to being those effective tools for God that we are called to be.
Yeah, I agree. There's a certain open-endedness to it, that it's not that there isn't any pressure to perform, as we see in Matthew 25 with the parable of the talents. But the standard, if you read between the lines, it's very much: are you trying or are you not? Are you trying to do your best wherever you are with whatever you have? He didn't set a particular amount that they had to make back. He just said, "Here's your responsibility, and go work with it."
Should we just recap the parable of the talents? Because I'm aware that there'll probably be some people watching who don't know the parable. Do you want to just retell it quickly?
Yeah. So you have a man going on a journey who is symbolically is God and Christ, and he gives money to 3 servants. And to one he gives, this one he says 5 bags of gold, and to one he gives 2 bags of gold, and to one he gives a single one. And the one who has 5 and the one who has 2, they go out and they use that money, investing in it or whatever, and getting a return, and they double their money. Whereas the one who has only 1 talent or 1 bag of gold, he buries it because he's fearful of taking that risk, because he knows his master has standards and expects effort and trying in return. And so, because he's fearful of taking a risk, fearful of stepping out, he buries it. And so, when his master comes back, the other 2 show that what they've gained, and they are rewarded with more because they have done well. And the one who can only turn over what he was given is viewed as lazy and wrong and wicked. What he has is taken away and given to the one with the most, because he did the most. And then the wicked, lazy servant is punished.
You could imagine these bags of gold representing different amounts of abilities, perhaps, in life, or inheritances, or whatever it is. But you could see how the person who has 1 bag of gold might look at the person with 2 bags of gold and say, well, you've got twice as much as me, so I was never going to be able to make back 2 bags of gold. But of course, the person with 2 bags of gold could have had the same attitude about the person with 5 bags of gold, and doesn't. And equally, there could be somebody who has half a bag of gold. So the excuse of having fewer talents than other people doesn't mean that you can just do nothing. Everybody is expected to make use of the things that they have. Equally, the person with 5 bags of gold could have easily buried 3 of them and only worked with the 2.
Yep.
And then compared themselves with the person with 2 bags and said, well, look, I'm at least keeping up. But no, the expectation is you evaluate yourself, you prayerfully interpret your own expectations for your life, and you should do it with ambition. This is not playing it safe, right? Even the suggestion from the master is, instead of burying it in the ground, you could have put it in, on deposit with the bankers. So at least don't have
you
got
could have done
interest.
the minimum. Yeah.
But like putting it in the bank with interest, some people would think is the kind of holy, risk-averse attitude. But that's not being praised here as the best possible outcome. That is, as you say, bare minimum.
Yeah.
Like, we should be really bold and take risks and go full pelt to double the wealth that we've been entrusted. All of the good things all of the abilities that we have, all of the talents that we have been given to us by God. So we've got no excuse for just returning them. We shouldn't return like the things that God has given to us unimproved. We should be looking to double and triple and quadruple what we've been entrusted with.
I think it's important to note too that we see grace and mercy in this parable, and the fact that the master does not put a quota on them. He isn't expecting a certain number. He's just expecting you to try your best, because he can judge your heart and he knows whether you did or not. So it's not about the numbers.
Yeah. Not doing it is described as wicked and lazy. So laziness is not something that the person self-evaluated, but it was an evaluation the master made of the servant. And the kind of, I think the implication here is that if the person had tried, they would have doubled their 1 bag of gold as well. That's in this fictional parable environment, then effort is returned as double over the time that the master is away. And that's not making a general claim about the world. That's just the particular rules in this this kind of parable environment. But it teaches a general principle that if you try hard, you will get whatever the results of that effort are in the real world, and God will be pleased with you for whatever you have achieved, knowing the effort that you put in. Good. Okay, there's the parable of the talents. Let's get back in our kind of safari vehicle. Where to next?
And kind of going back to a little bit what we touched on here about being concerned about risk, about not feeling like you have the confidence or being looked down upon. Titus and Timothy talk about this in a little bit. In 1 Timothy 4:12, it says, "Let no one look down on your youthfulness, but rather in speech, conduct, love, faith, and purity, show yourself an example of those who believe."
Mm-hmm.
And so it's a little bit of what we talked about in the sense that you are not trying to please men. You're not going for a certain quota per se, but rather stand firmly in your identity. As we're talking about with Timothy, we've already explored some of his identity, his foundation, his background. And so that is solid. So it doesn't matter that he's young. He's capable and he's trying. And Titus 2:15 says a similar thing in that in the last part of the verse it says, "Let no one disregard you." And I have a lot of sympathy with that, because even as a young man and even as a teenager, I put a lot of effort into studying and researching. And so I would see the flaws in what people were saying or what they might have been preaching or espousing politically. And I would often speak up about it. And of course, it got me in trouble too. But
yeah,
I couldn't accept hypocrisy or lies.
And worth young people recognizing that the people in their churches are not necessarily going to give them good advice, are not necessarily going to recognize their virtue. It's also a risk for young people that they become haughty and conceited, as we can see elsewhere. So they have to find the right balance between knowing if they are being looked down on unfairly just because they're young, or possibly that they are acting out of line. So that's a wisdom call. By the way, just got a super chat for the Lambda Wedding Fund. What $1.99. Thank you very much, Homerus Lupical.
He loves
War Master,
making the oddest names. That's one of the guys I do the Fading Giant podcast with.
Oh, great. Well, I appreciate that. I mean, I don't have. I'm single, so the wedding is a long way off. But I'll remember, God willing, whenever that happens, I'll put that $1.99 to something and think of you, War Master of Everest Terrace.
And like you're talking about, you have to guard against that arrogance, and that was a struggle I had because I felt confident in my knowledge and seeing and comparing and testing what other people said. I struggled with respecting older men if they weren't essentially perfect. And so as soon as they showed their flaws, I would lose respect for them. And it became a challenge for me to be forgiving that, just because the guy is older and maybe wiser in some ways or experienced, he's still human. He's still imperfect. And I just need to look at what he can show me, or what he could guide me with or be helpful with, and not expect him to be perfect. And I think that's a challenge for guys, especially if they didn't have the best of fathers or relationship with their fathers, because our fathers are our first image of God to a child. And that also reflects on a lot of people's relationship with God as well. Because if their earthly father was abusive or neglectful, it's going to reflect on God. It's going to reflect on other men. And it makes it hard to respect both.
Yeah, I'm very blessed to have had my father is a very good and godly man, and somebody I respect and look to emulate in many ways. So, but I can see that for for the many people who don't have that good earthly father figure, it becomes even more imperative to find examples of godly men from history that they can look to and learn from.
Yeah, and that's a good way to supplement some of your deficiency, because sometimes it's hard to really find someone who can be a good mentor. And so you can look to scripture, and you can look to biographies and history, and you can find some of that.
Even better
Another,
if you can find someone in real life.
yeah, yeah. Um, Another aspect of Titus and Timothy that I really found helpful was how they talked about interpersonal relationships, and basically laying out guidelines of how men and women, older and younger, married and single, and in the church, are supposed to interact with each other. Um, I have Titus 2 as an example of that,
Mm-hmm.
starting with verse 2. Older men be temperate, dignified, sensible, sound in faith, in love, and preservation. Older women likewise are to be reverent in their behavior, not malicious gossips, nor enslaved to much wine, teaching what is good, so that they may encourage the young women to love their husbands, to love their children, to be sensible, pure, workers at home, kind, being subject to their own husbands, so that the word of God will not be dishonored. Likewise, urge the young men to be sensible in all things. Show yourself to be an example of good deeds, with purity in doctrine, dignified, sound in speech, which is beyond reproach, so that the opponent will be put to shame, having nothing bad to say about us. And in this, we see the different kinds of social ties, or duties, responsibilities, and obligations shape our identity considerably. They help shape our place and purpose in the world. And we see a hierarchy of responsibility and obligation of older men and women mentoring and leading younger men and women, and helping and encouraging them in their duties and responsibilities.
Yeah, and I want just a thought as you were reading that, how beautiful and wholesome these things are as life goals. Um, for a lot of the millennials and especially Gen Z who might be watching, who have that drive, the temptation to visualize their life as, I want to be an influencer, I want to be a YouTuber, I want to be famous, I want to be popular on social media or whatever. What like contrast how that feels as a goal in life against these things that we just read. That one day as an old man you'll be temperate, worthy of respect, self-controlled, sound in faith, in love and endurance. As a woman, is it your dream to be compared to the Kardashians, or to be
Wine mom.
reverent, not addicted to wine, teaching what is good, young women to, do you want to be the socialite flitting from man to man, or do you want to have a husband and children who you love and be self-controlled and pure, busy at home, kind, subject to your husband? And as a young man, do you want to, focus on all of the kind of grim things that young men are pushed into being, or do you want to be known as self-controlled, integrity, and goodness and seriousness? These are the adjectives people should associate with you. Mm-hmm. Sound speech. Do you want to be somebody who is caught out by things that you've typed and said in difficult moments and that haunt you? Or do you want to be somebody who practices speaking in godly ways, so that those are just the furrows that you've ploughed, and you will naturally go towards things that you'll be proud of, to look back on your life and say, my speech cannot be condemned. And those who condemn me, because let's face it, those of us who do want to follow God will have opposition, and people will try to slander us. But when they try to do so, let us make them ashamed.
Yep, I agree.
Great.
And I think it's
Titus.
if you look at that at Titus and think about what it's describing, that's a very tight knit, close, encircling community of people looking out for each other and holding up one another through the ups and downs of life and just being there for each other to figure life out together.
And on the subject of identity, let's remember these are different instructions being given to different groups of people. Everybody should understand the group that they belong to. And I think the implication here is that the different groups will have different temptations and different requirements in life. That's why you're given different instructions. Again, this is not the humanism blasting out one set of instructions to everybody. This is figure out your identity. There's a proper way to live, a proper path to follow. And I didn't mention about this, we didn't read this passage about slaves, but I'd say anybody who is an employee should understand their position in the world as being different from being self-employed or an employer. And actually these pieces of advice are perfectly applicable. There's no reason not to consider yourself to need to be subject to your employer. You should try to please them, not talk back to them, and not to steal from them, but show that you're fully trustworthy to your employer. And bearing in mind that even in your place of employment, you will be a representative of God.
And if you're literally in that position, maybe you're in prison.
Yeah.
You think about the huge things that Joseph and Paul did as prisoners, the impact they had.
Yeah, the not only their fellow prisoners, but in both cases, the people who were imprisoning them took note of what they were doing and were really struck by the different behavior that they showed because of their faith. Great.
And I think that when we look at these social ties and we look at what kind of community that would form if we were following those principles, and we could see that it's very much the breakdown of these social ties that has left us so adrift and so confused about our identity. And I don't think it's an accident either, because I think humanism is pushing us to question everything without finding answers. And we can point to different causes like the Enlightenment or the Industrial Revolution or whatever, but ultimately these things can't be undone and often happen regardless of their wishes. You think about Jacob and his sons, they had to go to Egypt to survive. They didn't have a choice. And that altered their identity permanently. So instead, we have to find our place where we are and adapt to what is now. Kind of like what you said, we have some generic principles here in Titus, but how each community manifests them is going to be a little bit different. And we need to make peace with that and find contentment where we are. It doesn't mean we have to be satisfied. You can be content in the moment, but still unsatisfied with your current state. That's okay. And in fact, if we think about Matthew 25 and the parable of talents, making that effort means you are not satisfied with wherever you are and you're going to keep trying to do better. Especially if you believe you are called to do more. Because, some of us, we're not all called to be public figures or leaders. Some of us, our primary purpose is going to be a father and a husband. But that doesn't mean you're not going to mentor. It just might not mean you're head of a ministry or running your own business.
And of course, both being a father and being a husband are positions of leadership.
Exactly.
Perhaps over smaller numbers, but
still very relevant.
Very important, yeah.
Okay, you're shaping lives.
Yeah, and I think by not stressing the leadership position of a husband, we maybe think of the submission of women as a difficult ask, and that by not emphasizing that, we have let women off the hook. I actually think you could very well argue men have been let off the hook by the egalitarian marriage structures that have
Yes,
flourished in the West, more so than women. And actually, the greater sacrifice and the greater call is being ignored by the men who aren't leading as they ought.
exactly. They can't get at our women and children unless the men have already been compromised first. And,
All right, I
and
think we have. Sorry, go finish what you were saying.
And if, you know, and like we try to do too, if you think about the political history and the process, it wasn't feminism first. It
Mm.
was socialism influencing things like unionization and rapid urbanization through the Industrial Revolution that took the men out of their homes and out of their solid community and family leadership roles and left them kind of adrift and without community and hierarchy first that happened that opened the door for everything else. So going
Mm.
back to the men being in charge and being leading by example, because if you want
Interesting.
your wife to follow you, you have to first lead. Otherwise, where's she
Mm.
going to go? If you're not leading, if you're not stepping forward, how can she follow you? You're just standing there.
Sort of like a yeah. I mean the shepherd metaphor, right, is that you lead like Psalm 23, is it? The Lord is my shepherd.
Yes.
He leads me beside quiet waters. The the flock left to their own devices would not wander in the correct direction. They require the kind and um, but also strong, protective shepherd, and that is what good, honourable, godly leadership should be. It should be a blessing and a thing that people long for, rather than feeling stifled and suffocated by.
Mm-hmm. And then,
Good. I
kind of
think.
in closing,
Yeah.
like
Go on.
so you wrapping up for your own study at home. Proverbs is a great place to look because if you look at Proverbs, the first 7 chapters, for example, it literally open up as my son, and then it closes the same in chapter 31. It's very
Mm.
much an elder instructing a younger, and that's a good place to help you learn that. And then with Psalms is a good place to study human nature, the human condition, your heart and emotions, and understand how much emotions and feeling we can have without actually sinning, and that we can question God, that's okay. Over and over again in Psalms, we see that.
Mm.
And then, lastly, 1 Timothy 6:20. O Timothy, guard what has been entrusted to you. 1 Corinthians 16:13. Be on alert, stand firm in the faith, act like men, be strong. Let all that you do be done in love.
Mm. And you mentioned in the notes also Psalm 13.
Yeah, I cited that as a reference, as an example of David questioning God. So sometimes we forget that that's okay. God
Yeah.
invites us to speak to him, to cry out. A lot of Psalms are literally David looking up at the sky and going, why? What is going on? What am I supposed to do?
So if people are feeling confused and lost a little bit, unsure of their identity or place in the world, unclear on where they're at, they could take comfort in that is an understandable human experience, and even one
Mm-hmm.
that we are in the Psalms encouraged to wrestle with, and not in the expectation of immediate answers, but in the expectations that we nonetheless take comfort and solace in God, who is planning and orchestrating all things for our good.
Yes.
Were there any last thoughts before we close out? And I think I might finish actually just by reading this psalm.
No, I think that really wraps it up well.
Great. Well,
Because you
thanks
stated
again.
very much my point in bringing up the Psalms.
Thanks again for joining. And I encourage people watching once again to why not go and queue up one of Robert's videos to watch after this stream ends. But now let's finish with this psalm. How long, Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I wrestle with my thoughts and day after day have sorrow in my heart? How long will my enemy triumph over me? Look on me and answer, Lord my God, give light to my eyes, or I will sleep in death. And my enemy will say, I have overcome him, and my foes will rejoice when I fall. But I trust in your unfailing love. My heart rejoices in your salvation. I will sing the Lord's praises, for he has been good to me.
Amen.